mention Happy Father's Day to everybody. All right. Don't just sit there with the sweet and salty snacks. Get out loud. Malcolm out loud. Finish your thought there. I didn't, that was a quick hour, and I wanted to hear what you had to say about Orwell.
Yeah. John, it was a quick hour. There's so much more to this story. It's unbelievable. But we all read the George Orwell 1984. I mean, back in, we read it in the 70s, the 60s, whatever. We thought at the time, wow, that'll never happen. Here we are, right? Well, listen, that book sales right now, they've shot up 7,000%. People are definitely tuning in. Here's the good news, John, is after this revelation of the NSA's top secret programs of snooping on all of us, sales of Orwell's novel, 1984, are soaring everywhere. People want to know what Big Brother is all about. They want to understand, I think, what the risks are and what's involved here. I think, John, that this Edward Snowden, this 29-year-old kid, is a game changer. And here's the lesson tonight for everybody. For everybody who thinks that they can't change the world, for everybody who thinks they cannot make a difference, I got news for you. Here's a 29-year-old kid who just changed the whole paradigm. Don't you think, John?
Yes, I do. I'm not sure if I think we've become a culture of cliches and sound bites. But I think maybe hero might be a good word to use in connection with Edward Snowden.
I think it is. And John, let me say this, please. This is worth it. This is something that Edward said in that 12-minute interview on YouTube, which is incredible. And by the way, John, I don't know if you know this, but the likes on that interview are like 14,000 up and 800 down to tell you where America stands on that interview, okay?
Yep.
But finally, his final thoughts, which I think are interesting about this 29-year-old man. Why did he do this? Here's what he said. You cannot come forward against the world's most powerful intelligence agency and be completely free from risk. Back to your point of hero, John. They're such powerful adversaries that no one can meaningfully oppose them. If they want to get you, they'll get you. But at the same time, you have to make a determination on what it is that is important to you, and if living unfreely but comfortably is something you're willing to accept, and I think many of us are, human nature, get up to work, go to work, collect your check against the public image, and then go to sleep. And if you realize that this is the world you helped create, it's going to get worse with the next generation and the next generation to extend the capabilities of this sort of architecture. You realize that you might be willing to accept any risk. Back to your point, John Wells, this is probably a hero, this young man. Let's hope he stays on the tried and true, and he doesn't sell out. I pray to God he does not sell out to the Russians or the Chinese or anybody else, and he stays the line as an American young man trying to warn this country of the grave dangers that are ahead and the things you and I have chatted about over the last hour. And it is time for this country to stand up. There is so much more. Our allies are tipped. People are upset. He has definitely changed the paradigm here, folks. And it's time for everybody to step up. Yeah?
Thank you so much for being with us. It was too brief a time together, but I predict that we'll get together again on the air soon, if that's all right with you.
John, it was a pleasure. You are just a professional. Love everything you do there. You guys are great. Again, allow me to do two things, please. Get involved, getloud.com. People just email me, ask me what the site was again to get the free book and the Snoop and white paper. We'll send it to you free. It's all free, folks. It's just a matter of getting the stuff out there. And thank you, John. Pleasure to be with you tonight. God bless.
God bless you, sir. All right, coming up next, Joseph R. Banister. Graduate of San Jose State University, earned a bachelor degree in accounting, was a certified public accountant for 15 years, and in 1993 he accepted appointment to the Department of the Treasury, IRS Criminal Investigation Division as a special agent, that's criminal investigator. Mr. Banister is believed to be the first and only IRS Criminal Investigation Division special agent ever to conduct an off-duty investigation about claims that the federal income tax is fraudulently administered and enforced. After confronting top IRS officials about the validity of those claims, including his own IRS supervisors, he was encouraged to resign, and did so from the IRS on February 25, 1999. He has spoken out against the fraudulent administration and enforcement of the federal income tax ever since. Tonight we'll discuss with him the IRS fiasco. Joseph R. Banister is next on Coast to Coast AM. Stand by. The last time Joe Banister was on Coast to Coast AM was December 2nd, 2007. Ship's Captain George Norrie interviewed him at that time. His websites are freedomabovefortune.com, 900, write it out, 900.net, and joebannister.blogspot.com. Say, you're a real troublemaker, Joe Banister. Welcome to the program. Delighted to have you.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me. I guess I've stirred up a little trouble over the years.
Good for you. Good for you. Well,
try to assert your freedom and your rights and see what happens, huh?
Yeah, it's interesting. I got an email from Marcel a while ago who said, after the grief whistleblowers receive for naively telling the truth, more often than not our lives are destroyed not for lying but telling the truth. Corruption is fought in the trenches by whistleblowers. I agree.
I agree myself. I really can't hold a candle to what Mr. Snowden has done, but I guess we all blow the whistle as best we can in the situations we're put in.
Well, according to what I'm reading about you, you'd have done the same thing if you were in that position. So what do you make of this? I understand now there was a little blurb on, of course, there's so many news sites out there, but I go to Drudge because it's a good place to start and then, just go on from there. But I understand that nobody at any of the Tea Parties has been contacted by anybody regarding this IRS investigation, which is a huge shock, but not really. So how deep is this hole?
Well, I think, as you've been hearing, a lot of the talking heads, at least the ones that are trying to pacify the public and help them to go back to sleep, it's not, a few nincompoops in Cincinnati. The IRS is a very top-down organization, and you don't do a whole lot without your supervisors knowing what you're doing, and you certainly don't create policy or decide which groups or people are going to be scrutinized. That all comes from the top, from the policymakers in D.C. The IRS is very top-heavy, actually, with management, grade 14 and above officials who've got nothing better to do than to create these policies. And so, I thought from the start that it's going to go up pretty darn high. And I think we've been hearing how Lois Lerner and a bunch of attorneys there, pretty darn high up in the IRS, had their fingers in it.
It's very interesting here. You were hired and sworn in November 1993, and the president of both training classes at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, trained with the 6-hour 9mm handgun. I guess that's a .226. The Remington shotgun, defensive tactics, evasive defensive driving techniques, search warrant execution, criminal investigation, financial investigation techniques, and got yelled at your first day on the job for actually looking at the pages of the Internal Revenue Code.
Yeah, that was a culture shock. I had spent quite a few years on the outside, the private sector. Usually it's the other way around. The people will generally go into the IRS directly from college or right out of high school. I spent a number of years in the private sector first and really had an itch to get into law enforcement. So, it was real culture shock to be there the first day. And I thought, hey, you get a job as a criminal investigator, start investigating. And I started with the Internal Revenue Code, which contained the laws that I was supposed to investigate. And I got yelled at by my boss. He was a former Marine and quite a gruff guy. And he said, "What are you doing looking in that book?" He said, "You're not a CPA anymore. You're a special agent. You don't need to be looking in that book." So they didn't like looking at the law, I guess, pamphlets and training literature, but don't look at the authoritative underlying law.
And why is that, Joe?
Well, it's just a culture there, John. I mean, there's obviously so much. The law, the manuals, the procedures are so voluminous. I really can't blame the average IRS worker for not delving in, because you really need to jump in with both feet, and it takes an enormous amount of time, and most people don't want to devote the time. And for me, I just felt that I had a duty to devote the time because I was, of course, came across these allegations and claims that the income tax was actually enforced and administered beyond what the law allowed. And I heard it from some credible people. And although I was quite skeptical, that started my journey into looking into these issues. And as you mentioned, it was an off-duty look and investigation. I didn't ask my bosses for some kind of official prescription to do it. I just took my own time, weekends and evenings. And for about 2 years, while I still went to work every day as an IRS Special Agent, and was very skeptical, expected to disprove these claims and allegations, but I kept on finding a huge amount of evidence indicating that it was true, that the IRS was lying to the public about their income tax obligations and basically stealing from them, and nobody seemed to want to talk about it. And I guess I was just naive enough to try to blow the whistle on it.
Let me ask you something. What led you to work for the IRS?
Well, that's a good question, and I basically tell people that I'm a pretty naive guy, or maybe less now. I'm 50 years old now, but through my life, pretty darn naive. I mean, I give people the benefit of the doubt, and I really believed that my country, I was about 30 years old when I went in the IRS, and I really thought that I could use my financial skills, all my training, to help my country. And, of course, I still believe that my country needs help, that we need good people in the government. We need government. So I guess I just had kind of this, apple pie kind of belief that I could make a positive difference working for the government. And even the IRS, I guess it was just because of my background in accounting and taxation that the IRS was the best fit. It's not that I was itching to go out and shake people down for their lunch receipts and things like that. The IRS has the Criminal Investigation Division is actually considered the premier financial investigative agency in the world. And so, the idea grew on me. I actually started to become an FBI agent, and there just was a hiring freeze in the early 90s that made that impossible. Meanwhile, the IRS called me, and the idea kind of grew on me. I had all the background. I made a good fit. It's not exactly the kind of career path that you want to tell everybody what you do at the party, because I didn't have that many friends as it was. But once you start working for the IRS, they all kind of disappear.
Yeah, that's kind of a future date killer, isn't it?
Yeah. Fortunately, I was married with children at the time, so
okay, good.
Didn't worry about that.
Well, you just used, I believe you just used the expression they're the premier investigative agency in the world.
Well, that's what they call themselves, and I mean, I can't have sour grapes in terms of their training, and and I've not abandoned the belief that we need really good, really competent financial investigators. I mean, a lot of crime deals with high finance, with stealing money, embezzlement. There's all kinds of different white-collar crimes that are crimes and need to be investigated, and you really have to have a special expertise and acumen to know how to go after that. In fact, it made me a pretty popular guy with other law enforcement agencies because, they'd see a whole box or room full of records of, papers and things, and their eyes would glaze over and go, well, what are we going to do with this? But, I would know how to dig in there and find the evidence that was needed to go after big-time money launderers and drug dealers, where the average law enforcement person couldn't do anything about it because, if they didn't catch the guy with the drugs in their hands or in their car, they're pretty much out of luck. But a financial investigator can dig deep and find that paper trail and hook them up that way.
So I guess you work some interesting cases. I mean, what does a person have to do to attract this particular department?
Well, the main difference between the IRS having a civil inquiry versus a criminal inquiry has to do with intent. Even the courts recognize that the income tax laws, many tax laws, are complex, difficult to understand, and it's quite common for people to make mistakes in trying to deal with them. And so the civil people, when it comes to audits and collection and things like that, they don't really care why you did what you did. They presume that it's a mistake, and then they just, hammer you with fines and penalties for having made that mistake. The criminal investigation arena deals with having the likelihood that you can prove there was an intentional violation. In the tax circles, it's called willfulness. So the criminal guys, the criminal investigators, guys and gals, are looking for evidence of willfulness, that you knew you had a duty to do something, and then you intentionally violated that duty to do something.
Mm-hmm. Money laundering isn't quite as easy as it was before. You could open a pizza place, and you actually didn't sell quite as many pizzas as you indicated that you did. This is, I understand that there's an apparatus set up among money launderers where they start, they'll wire money from one bank to another until they've wired it to so many banks that you can't really tell where it started. Is there any truth to that, or is that movie stuff?
No, that's called kiting, K-I-T-I-N-G. They try to funnel it through enough gateways that they'll kind of lose the trail. It's difficult to do because if there's a lot of money involved, as long as you have a paper trail, it doesn't matter how many gateways the investigator has to pass through. And you're also correct that, as time goes on and there's less and less cash being transacted, it's much more difficult for people to, hide, shall we say. Of course, I worked with the money laundering laws when I was an IRS Special Agent, and I was really saddened, disappointed that, the laws were intended to go after the drug dealers and make the world a safer place. But what I found was that actually the money laundering laws were just one of the early steps of the federal government finding ways to snoop on the American people. And, I saw that 99 out of 100 drug dealers and money launderers were going along their merry way, but it was the average American dealing in cash or just trying to live their lives that were being spied upon. And so it's almost like this whole NSA and these IRS scandals, these kinds of mechanisms were being put in place in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s with such precision that it's as if it was an organized, plan from the start. Like they're just putting in the puzzle pieces, and meanwhile we're all fat, dumb, and happy, and not realizing that they're putting that noose around our necks, and we don't realize that it's there, and yet it's getting tighter.
We're coming up on a little break here, and I have a question that I think is going to take quite a long answer, but just kind of give us the setup for that. So in the tax business, it's the same as in any other business. The only one that can get a good deal is the one who doesn't need one? Because that's kind of what it sounds like. It seems like the more money you have to play with, the less exposure you actually pull. Am I close or getting farther away?
No, I mean, if what you mean is that the big players can do what they do with impunity, and yet it's the little guys who generally get nailed, is that what you're driving at?
That's what I'm driving at.
Well, I think that's very much the case. And what's sad is, the biggest operators, the biggest banks, and, the money laundering and drug dealing really couldn't occur unless the government had their fingers in it. And so that's what's the saddest thing of all is that that's what's going on.
All right. Well, we'll get into that and a lot more with Joseph R. Banister, former IRS man, special agent. As we carry on through the night, Saturday night soiree here on Coast to Coast AM. Keeping the country free. Just spy on everybody. A few criminals will fall through the screen. There they are, and we'll snatch them up and prosecute them. Who knows? Maybe we can get more out of them if we send them to Guantanamo. Yeah. Well, welcome to the Orwellian State of today. But then again, even that book has an end. We shall see if we can get to the end of it in our actual lives. It's going to be a long haul, though, I have a feeling. For the remainder of the program, we'll be talking with our guest, had been on the program since 2007. That's Joseph R. Banister, former IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent. Lots of stuff to talk about with him, so quickly get yourself a proper cup of tea. And people have asked, what is a proper cup of tea? Well, you need a china cup so the tannins don't stick to the side. And that's pretty much it. If you want to boost, brew it for about a minute and a half. And if you want to mellow out, brew it for about 3 minutes. And that is that. I'm talking about Chinese black tea primarily. Anyway, enough of that. We'll be back in a minute with Joe Banister on Coast to Coast AM. Do stand by. Joe Banister, now, as I understand your situation, while you were working as an IRS special agent, you became aware at some point that the federal income tax was improperly administered and enforced, and you decided to investigate those claims for yourself. If that's correct, what did you find?
That is correct. I was there at the IRS for about 5.5 years, and about 3 years into that 5.5-year period is when I first listened to this talk radio show where these topics came up, basically that most Americans weren't required to pay the federal income tax. And the reasons that were given on the radio that day were that it was voluntary in the sense that there was an absence of a mandate. You tried to look through the federal laws for a place that required you to file a Form 1040, and you came up with places or reasons for people to file in certain circumstances, such as if you're an American who paid a payment to a non-resident alien or a foreign corporation. But in terms of just the average American living and working in the United States, you couldn't find a place anywhere in the Internal Revenue Code where you were liable to pay the federal income tax. And so I spent about 2 years while I still worked at the IRS investigating these claims, and then they've been doing it ever since. And, of course, I've been, over the years, trying to get the IRS, the Department of Justice, to come to the table and answer up for this very clear evidence. And, you know, many other people and groups long before me and in much greater efforts than I could ever muster by myself. But there's just a huge number of people for decades that have been trying to get this information, getting confirmation and answers from the government, but they always squirm out. But I could reduce it down to a couple things. I mean, first of all, to be required to pay a tax, you have to be liable to pay the tax. And I'll give you an example. Many people probably have some brandy in their liquor cabinet, and they'd think it was kind of odd if the ATF showed up at their house and said, hey, you've got some brandy in your liquor cabinet, and we're here to collect the tax on it. Well, why doesn't that ever happen? It never happens because the law doesn't make the person with the brandy in their liquor cabinet liable to pay the tax on that liquor. The person who's liable to pay the tax on that liquor was the manufacturer, the distiller, way back at the beginning when the alcohol was distilled. And when you look in the law, it's clear that that distiller is the person liable to pay the tax on that liquor. And so when you have your brandy or cognac in your liquor cabinet, you're not having to pay any tax. Nobody's showing up at your door. And you can go to every federal tax, and it follows that same pattern. Even the income tax follows the pattern of making someone liable. However, the only people that are made liable in the Internal Revenue Code, Subtitle A, which is the income tax part of the Internal Revenue Code, is someone who makes a payment to a non-resident alien or foreign corporation. And when you look deeper into the issue, you find that it's not an oversight. The Congress didn't just happen to forget to make someone liable other than these payers to foreigners. It was done on purpose or avoided on purpose because of the constitutional limitations to income taxation. And all the evidence is there. It's just that it is very voluminous, and it takes a while for people to take the time. There's a website that I'm aware of, if I can give it out, where people can do a little follow-up study.
Sure.
It's called truthattack.com, but it's truth and then a dash and then attack.com. And that website was founded by an attorney, a tax attorney named Tom Cryer. Unfortunately, he passed away about a year ago, but his legacy lives on in terms of his analysis. He was a trial attorney for over 30 years, really an incredible story. But anyway, as far as a follow-up for people who are listening, you can go to the law library section of truth-attack.com and see a really, really good analysis of this, how you have to be made liable for a tax. And it makes sense. It has a common sense aspect to it, too. If you don't make someone liable to pay a tax, you can't, reach out and grab somebody. The law has to designate someone who is liable to pay a tax, and it's the income tax where the average American is not liable for the tax. And even the IRS admits in their own instruction booklet, if anyone happens to have an IRS Form 1040 instruction booklet laying around, look at the Paperwork Act and Paperwork Reduction and Privacy Act notice that's in the instruction booklet, and the IRS themselves say that you have to file a tax return and pay a tax for any tax you are liable for. So, the IRS agrees that you should, and I agree, because that's the law. If you're liable for a tax, you need to keep records, you need to file a return. But when you go and look for that liability section in the federal law, it's not there, and it's not an oversight. Now, another issue...
Go ahead. No, I got a bunch of questions for you. You just keep rolling.
Okay, well, the second prong, just to kind of keep things relatively simple, is the word income, because, of course, they call it an income tax, and income is taxed. But what is income? Well, there's a constitutional definition for income, and it turns out, and this, again, makes good common sense, that the Supreme Court has said that the Congress can't define terms in the Constitution. Why? Because it's the Constitution that gives Congress its power. So if Congress could redefine or, make whatever definition they liked of terms in the Constitution, that could be kind of a problem, right? Because they might say that a well-regulated militia has to fit on the back of a postage stamp or something like that.
Right.
So the Supreme Court has to define these terms. And so if you look through the entire Internal Revenue Code, you'll find that the word income is not defined there. And it can't be because all those laws came from the Congress. But the U.S. Supreme Court can define terms in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court has defined the term income. And they defined it as a gain or an accession to wealth, something that's severed from the capital. And when you or I or anyone else, any other American, goes to work for a living, and we trade an hour of our time for an hour of pay, we have not realized any gain. We've invested, if I make $30 an hour, I've invested $30 of my time in that hour of work, and I got $30 back.
Right.
There's no gain there.
Yeah, so it's even.
Right. And, if you look at all the Supreme Court cases, there's dozens of them. And I can name some of them sometime in the show if you like. But again, if people go to truth-attack.com, you can see them all listed there, and you could read them for yourself. And, so there's a couple issues where the liability or absence thereof, and the definition of income, where the IRS and really the entire federal government is lying to the public, or they're just not telling the public, and the public is, doesn't know better, because how many tax accountants are there out in the population? And then anyone who tries to speak up about the truth, they get hammered like so many nails that are too high.
Sure. I got a question that's been dogging me for a long time. I mentioned earlier in the program that we've become a nation of sound bites and cliches, but, everything is broken. The immigration system is broken. Our healthcare system is broken. Our tax system is broken. Why is everything, I won't even get into why is everything broken. It would be probably more interesting to discuss why do these morons keep saying these things, but never mind. The income tax code, there seems to be a consensus that it's a very complex instrument. Why is the income tax code so complex, or is it really?
It is. It's extremely complex. It's basically, I don't know if you picture a house or a building where they don't just take some dynamite to it and start over, that they just keep patching and patching and patching and patching and patching, and they end up with this myriad of patches and a structure that's not all that sound. And, if you bring someone competent in to fix something, they throw up their hands and go, well, heck, where do we start? Because it's such a mess. And my opinion of the situation is that the income tax system it's a system that was the darling of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, okay? Not the darling of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And therefore, an income tax system is incompatible with a constitutional republic. It's like a square peg being pounded into a round hole. It's not going to fit. And so the talk of it being broken, and I really chuckle as you say that because it's so true, but it's broken because it was broken from the start. It was a bastard child from the start. In fact, the Philander Knox, who was the Secretary of State in 1913, he fraudulently proclaimed that the 16th Amendment had been ratified when it actually had not been. There's ironclad proof that it was not properly ratified. And yet, Philander Knox, great first name, decided to tell the world and America that, oh, yes, the 16th Amendment was ratified by the adequate number of states. So even putting aside, that Marx and Engels loved an income tax system, it's been a lie from the very beginning back in 1913. And so I'm really not that surprised when I see these scandals. I'm horrified by them. I don't like that, good Americans are being attacked and harassed. But it's the nature of the beast. It's when you think about it. I mean, do you ever meet anybody that likes the income tax or that is happy with the system? So it's like, well, why do we have it? Well, we have it because the tail is wagging the dog. There are interests in society that want the income tax to be there because it's a mechanism of control. It's a way to keep people intimidated, and it's a way to make the Federal Reserve run properly the way it was designed to run, which is to fleece us of all of our blood, sweat, and tears while we stay on the gerbil wheel producing, and most of our production gets sucked away.
So it's the Federal Reserve again.
Well, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, and the income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment, was allegedly ratified in 1913. And again, it's not a coincidence that these two mechanisms were put in place in the exact same year. This is not a coincidence. It was absolutely planned that way for a reason, because the income tax is got to be there to, in a sense, sop up or mop up all the money that's being printed. And they work great together At least they work great for some people. But you really have to have an income tax if you're going to have money created out of thin air, and both of those were instituted about 100 years ago.
Yeah. Now, did everybody hear what he just said? If you're you have to have this in place if you're going to create money out of thin air. So let me ask you this, Joe. How serious a threat is this near $17 trillion debt, since the money doesn't really exist?
Well, I mean, I'm no monetary expert or economist. I mean, basically a former CPA who's, has a decent knowledge. But
I gotcha.
I think the biggest problem is, this is something I think most people, they don't have to be an accountant to understand this. Every year, Congress has to raise the debt ceiling. Okay, they have to pass a law that permits us to borrow even more money. Why are we doing that? We're doing that because we have to borrow more money to pay the interest on the debt we've borrowed in the past. So it will never end.
Ever.
Ever. Because think about it, and this is something everyone can understand. If you have a credit card, okay, and you make $50,000 a year, but you borrow, say, $20,000 a year at 20% interest, and you do that year after year after year after year, will you ever be able to pay off? Will you even be able to pay off a dime of your principal? Ever?
Well, no, it's like a credit card. If you make the minimum payment every month, your bill gets bigger every month, and you'll never pay it off. That's the idea.
Exactly, and that's what really our country is. Any country with a central bank is faced with. And then you get into this argument every year about, well, should we or shouldn't we raise the debt ceiling? And if we don't, what kind of Armageddon will happen? Well, it'll be Armageddon, just like a heroin addict who doesn't get his fix. I mean, it will be Armageddon. But the heroin addict is going to be dead, in the curb as well. So,
well, the reason I don't want to get too far afield with this, but too much off topic. But you're obviously a thinking man. You've been involved in this, and supposedly, I presume that the income tax from the American taxpayers that constitutes a significant chunk of change for the powers that be. So what's the end game here? If we can never pay off this debt, and if they can create money out of thin air, as we mentioned a little while ago, as you did, then couldn't you just say, all right, that's it, and just pull an Iceland and just say, that's it. The interest is forgiven. Forget it. There is no interest. We're going to reset and start over. What would that bring about? Armageddon as much as, or would that be the same thing as running out of money if they just said, forget it? We're going to, same thing as when you've gone so late on your credit card payments that they go, look. You owe $4,000, but if you'll send us $2,500, we're good, and we'll close your account and you're paid off. Couldn't they just write it off?
Yeah, because you bring up Iceland. I mean, that's a country where, it's, if you ever had a prayer of looking for an example of people who really had, a backbone. That enough people in Iceland said, we've had enough. And, you'd think, or we Americans think that, hey, we've got a backbone like that. But I haven't quite seen it yet, but I think it's there. That the Icelandic people realized that it was a scam in the sense that the people are being saddled with this debt that they never agreed to. And it was just these corrupt officials that were allowing the big brokerage firms to saddle the government with the debt, with bailouts. And so...
Understood. We got to stop again. A typical fast hour with a very interesting guest, Joseph R. Banister. We'll be right back in a few minutes on Coast to Coast AM.